On the evening when winter pressed its pale face against the windows of Whitcomb House, society gathered to admire what it had already decided to love. Carriages arrived in a steady procession, wheels hissing on frost, lanterns bobbing like captive stars. Inside, chandeliers bloomed with light, scattering gold across silk gowns and polished marble, and the air trembled with music, perfume, and expectation. It was the kind of night that promised elevation to some and erasure to others, though only a few yet knew which fate awaited them. Arabella Whitcomb stood at the center of that brilliance as if it had been arranged for her alone. Her hair, the color of ripe chestnuts, was dressed with pearls. Her gown fell in obedient folds that emphasized grace without effort. She had been trained, from her first steps, to inhabit admiration. Compliments reached her as naturally as breath, and she received them with a practiced smile that revealed neither hunger nor doubt. Tonight, she was the jewel her family intended to display, the proof that the Whitcomb name still commanded reverence. Several paces behind her stood her sister, Eleanor. She was dressed neatly, even tastefully, yet without ornament, as though decoration itself were a presumption. Where Arabella's posture declared ownership of the room, Eleanor's suggested careful permission. She kept her hands folded, her eyes lowered not from humility but from habit, for it had long been safer to watch the world from its edges. Guests glanced past her as one might glance past a piece of furniture, aware of form, indifferent to substance. Eleanor had learned early that silence could be a form of shelter. While Arabella was ushered into drawing rooms and gardens, Eleanor was kept within corridors, libraries, and half-lit parlors, introduced when necessary as a companion, a convenience, a shadow. Her existence was explained away with vague phrases, delicate health, modest temperament, unfortunate circumstances, none of which quite reached the truth. She had grown accustomed to being present yet unnamed, visible yet unconsidered, and she carried that knowledge like a bruise beneath her ribs. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when Eleanor allowed herself to imagine another life. She imagined speaking without apology, laughing without consequence, being addressed directly rather than through another's authority. Yet such imaginings were dangerous. They bred disappointment, and disappointment invited rebellion. So she buried those thoughts beneath routine and obedience, learning the careful art of endurance, which demanded strength without acknowledgement and patience without reward. The guests, meanwhile, spoke eagerly of the man who had not yet arrived. The Duke of Ravensmere, recently returned from abroad, was the evening's unspoken axis. His fortune, his lineage, his rumored severity passed from mouth to mouth, embroidered with speculation. Mothers straightened daughters' shoulders at the sound of his title. Fathers weighed futures in quiet calculation. When at last his name was announced, the room shifted, as though an invisible hand had tightened every string. He entered without flourish, tall and composed, his dark coat severe against the light. There was nothing careless in his bearing, yet neither was there ostentation. His gaze moved slowly, observantly, as if he were less interested in being seen than in seeing. When he was presented to Arabella, she inclined her head with perfect timing, her smile bright as cut glass. The Duke bowed, said precisely what was required, and all proceeded according to the ritual society revered. It was then that a small disruption occurred, quiet yet cutting. As the hostess gestured for Arabella to step forward, her hand flicked toward Eleanor with absent authority. "You may wait there," she said, mistaking Eleanor for an attendant. Laughter fluttered, light and careless. No one corrected the error. Eleanor felt the heat rise to her face, a familiar burn, and stepped back obediently, the marble cool beneath her thin soles. In that instant, memories surfaced unbidden, lessons observed from doorways, meals taken after others had finished, her name spoken softly, as though it might offend the air. The humiliation did not shock her. It confirmed her place. What wounded more deeply was the ease with which the world accepted her diminishment, as if it were natural law rather than human choice. From that lowered vantage, she saw the Duke pause. His attention, which should have returned at once to Arabella, lingered instead on the space Eleanor had vacated. his brow furrowed almost imperceptibly. When his eyes found her, there was no pity in them, nor amusement, but something quieter and more dangerous: recognition. Their gazes met, briefly, and in that instant Eleanor felt exposed in a way she had never permitted before. The music resumed, conversation swelled, and the moment dissolved, yet its echo remained. Arabella did not notice the change. She was too accustomed to certainty. Eleanor, however, sensed a subtle shift, as though a door-long sealed had been nudged, not opened, but acknowledged. She retreated further into the shadows, her heart unsettled, aware that being seen could invite both rescue and ruin. As the night wore on, the Duke moved through the room, performing his role with restraint. Servants whispered, guests speculated, and subtle glances were exchanged like currency. Eleanor felt those glances brush against her back, light yet insistent, as if her presence had unsettled a balance no one wished to examine too closely. The room, once merely grand, now felt watchful, alert to a possibility it dared not name. Still, more than once, his gaze returned to the margins, to the quiet figure who did not belong to the spectacle yet had been shaped by it. And Eleanor, standing where she had been told to stand, understood with sudden clarity that invisibility, once broken, could never be restored without cost. The world had noticed her, if only for a breath, and somewhere within that breath lay the beginning of a reckoning yet to come, a reckoning that would demand truth and a courage she had never been allowed to claim. Nothing, she sensed, would ever return to its former silence. Again now, the morning after the ball arrived without mercy. Pale light crept through the tall windows of Whitcomb House, revealing the aftermath of splendor like a confession. Flowers wilted in their vases, wax dripped into hardened tears, and the air still carried the ghost of perfume mingled with smoke. Eleanor rose airily, as she always did, moving quietly through rooms that never quite belonged to her, carrying with her the unease of a night that refused to settle into memory. At breakfast, Arabella glowed with triumph. She spoke of compliments received, of glances exchanged, of futures hinted at with knowing smiles. Their mother listened with satisfaction thinly veiled as maternal pride, encouraging each detail as if it were an investment report. Eleanor sat slightly apart, attending to her tea, saying little. She felt the weight of her sister's radiance press against her like heat, familiar and suffocating, yet beneath it stirred something new and unsteady. It announced itself with the arrival of a parcel later that afternoon. The footman hesitated when he read the card, then handed it not to Arabella but to Eleanor, his brows drawn in faint confusion. The paper was thick, the script elegant and restrained. Inside lay a small volume bound in dark green leather, its pages edged with gold, and a note written in a firm, spare hand. The Duke of Ravensmere thanked Miss Whitcomb for her observation on the previous evening and hoped she might find the enclosed work agreeable. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she closed the book. No one had ever sought her opinion before, least of all a man whose notice could alter the course of families. She did not look up at once, but she felt Arabella's gaze sharpen, curiosity curdling into something colder. The gift was modest, almost scholarly, yet it carried a significance that no jewel could rival. It declared that she had been remembered, deliberately and by name. Whispers followed swiftly, as they always did when order was disturbed. During a charitable visit later that week, Eleanor sensed eyes tracking her movements, conversations halting when she passed. A lady whom she scarcely knew inquired, too casually, whether she enjoyed reading philosophy. Another remarked upon the elegance of her handwriting, though Eleanor could not recall ever writing to her. Each comment felt like a pinprick, small yet cumulative, mapping a pattern she did not wish to see. The Duke did not approach her openly, but his presence threaded through her days. At a dinner hosted by mutual acquaintances, he addressed a question to her directly, seeking her thoughts on a passage that had troubled him. The table fell silent. Eleanor answered carefully, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. When he inclined his head in acknowledgment, the approval seemed to ripple outward, unsettling those who had assumed her insignificance immutable. Arabella's patience thinned. Her kindness, once effortless, became measured, conditional. She reminded Eleanor of obligations and appearances, of gratitude owed for shelter and inclusion. Her smiles tightened at the edges, revealing strain beneath polish. In private, she spoke of caution, of how easily misunderstanding could arise, of how fragile reputations were, particularly for those without clear standing. Eleanor listened, recognizing the warning disguised as concern. The true rupture came during a garden party held beneath a reluctant sun. Guests drifted among trimmed hedges and marble statuary, pretending ease while performing constant appraisal. When the Duke arrived, conversation shifted toward him like iron filings to a magnet. Arabella positioned herself with precision, her laughter pitched to carry. Eleanor stood apart, content to observe the roses and the faint tremor in her own hands. Without ceremony, the Duke crossed the lawn and offered Eleanor his arm. The gesture was unadorned, unmistakable. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Eleanor hesitated, acutely aware of every eye upon them, then accepted. As they walked, murmurs spread like a breeze through leaves, gentle yet impossible to ignore. Arabella's face remained composed, but something dark flashed behind her eyes before she turned away. That evening, Eleanor was summoned to her sister's room. The lamplight cast sharp shadows, exaggerating the angles of familiar furniture into something hostile. Arabella closed the door with deliberate care. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but edged with steel. She reminded Eleanor of her place, of favors extended, of sacrifices made. She spoke of danger, of ruin, of how easily a misplaced hope could be corrected by fame intervention. Eleanor listened in silence, her hands clenched. She felt shame rise, but also a surprising resistance. For the first time, the narrative of her smallness felt insufficient. When Arabella finished, Eleanor answered with measured dignity, insisting she had invited nothing and intended nothing improper. The words sounded brave even to her own ears, and the novelty frightened her. Sleep eluded her that night. Each sound of the house settling felt like a verdict delayed, each creak a question unanswered. She imagined doors opening, letters arriving, faces hardening with judgment. The future, once a narrow corridor, now branched into uncertain rooms, some lit with possibility, others dark with consequence. Eleanor lay still, aware that the smallest gesture, offered without witness, had begun to rearrange the architecture of her world. She breathed carefully, as though restraint itself might preserve balance a little longer before dawn exposed everything she feared most. Later, alone in her room, Eleanor opened the Duke's book and found a pressed flower tucked between its pages, delicate and carefully preserved. It was a token so small it might have been overlooked, yet it carried a promise she could not yet name. As she held it, she understood that the quiet life she had perfected was already slipping beyond her reach. The attention she had neither sought nor refused was gathering consequence, and somewhere between curiosity and condemnation, society prepared to choose its story. Eleanor sensed that the next choice would not be Hayes alone, and that the cost of being seen was about to be demanded in full. The invitation arrived folded within restraint, sealed in dark wax bearing the Duke's crest, delivered without announcement. Eleanor held it as though it might dissolve under the weight of her uncertainty. The message was brief, requesting her presence at Ravensmere House to return a book mistakenly left behind. No hour was specified beyond the courtesy of afternoon, and yet the request felt deliberate, edged with intention she could neither deny nor define. Ravensmere House rose from the winter fields with austere grace, its stone pale beneath a sky heavy with cloud. Eleanor entered through a side door, her footsteps softened by thick carpets and discipline learned early. She was guided not to a drawing room, but to the library, a long chamber lined with leather spines and shadowed alcoves. Firelight stirred there, steady and contained, as if the room itself understood the value of silence. The Duke stood by the hearth when she entered, his posture composed, his expression unreadable. He greeted her with courtesy unmarred by condescension, his voice low, precise. For a moment they spoke only of the book, of its author, of ideas that lingered long after ink had dried. The conversation unfolded carefully, each word chosen as though misplacement might shatter something fragile between them. It was Eleanor who first faltered. The weight of being alone with him, unmediated by society's armor, pressed upon her resolve. She confessed, haltingly, that his attentions had unsettled her. She spoke not in accusation but in honesty, admitting fear as readily as gratitude. To be seen, she said, had always been dangerous. Her voice did not tremble, but her hands did, betraying the effort required to remain composed. The Duke listened without interruption, his gaze fixed not upon her face but upon the fire, as though granting her the dignity of unobserved confession. When she finished, he turned to her fully. He spoke of weariness, of years spent navigating rooms where truth was ornamental and affection transactional. He admitted that something in her restraint, her careful dignity, had drawn his attention against his own expectation. There are truths one feels, he said quietly, long before one is permitted to know them. The words settled between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor felt a stirring she could not yet name, equal parts hope and alarm. She answered that feeling alone could not protect her, that her life had been shaped by concealment she did not choose. At this, the Duke surprised her by producing a small object from his pocket. It was a locket, worn smooth by time. He placed it in her palm without explanation. Eleanor recognized it at once. She had lost it years ago, during a summer long since eclipsed by silence. Inside was a faded miniature of her mother, painted before sorrow had thinned her smile. Eleanor's breath caught. She asked how he had come by it, and he answered simply that he had found it among his late father's effects, stored without context or remark. The coincidence felt too sharp to be chance. Emotion threatened to overwhelm her, but she steadied herself. She spoke then of her childhood, of rooms she was not permitted to enter, of lessons overheard rather than attended. She did not accuse her family outright, yet the absence in her story spoke loudly enough. The Duke's expression darkened, not with judgment, but with concern sharpened by recognition that something had been deliberately obscured. For a time, neither spoke. The fire whispered, the clock marked its patient seconds, and Eleanor felt the strange relief of being neither judged nor directed. She studied the room, noticing marginalia in the Duke's books, evidence of a mind that questioned rather than consumed. He noticed her attention and remarked that ownership meant little without understanding. The exchange, simple as it was, bound them in a shared reverence for thought over display. She confessed then a smaller truth, one she had never voiced, that she had learned to anticipate dismissal before it arrived, to diminish herself preemptively as a form of armor. The Duke replied not with reassurance but with respect, acknowledging the discipline such survival required. He said quietly that endurance, when unchosen, was its own kind of courage, and that courage deserved witness. Eleanor felt the words settle within her, unsettling and affirming all at once. The intimacy of that recognition unsettled her more than flattery ever could. She wondered whether he perceived the danger as clearly as she did, or whether his station insulated him from the consequences she had learned to fear. Still, she did not retreat, sensing that retreat now would cost her something essential, perhaps irrevocable. The silence between them deepened, charged with unspoken possibility and restrained resolve. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of tea, the mundane ritual briefly anchoring them to the present. The Duke poured with care, his movements unhurried, as though time itself had softened within those walls. He remarked upon the injustice of a world that measured worth by visibility, and Eleanor replied that invisibility had been her refuge, though never her choice. The admission felt like surrender. As afternoon light waned, a knock sounded at the door. A servant entered bearing a letter, its seal unbroken, its presence abrupt. The Duke accepted it, his brow furrowing as he read. Eleanor sensed the shift before he spoke, the room tightening around a new tension. He folded the letter with deliberate calm and told her only that matters had arisen requiring discretion. When she rose to leave, the Duke accompanied her to the door. His voice, when he spoke her name, carried a gravity she had not heard before. He said that some truths, once stirred, demanded pursuit, regardless of consequence. Eleanor met his gaze, understanding that the fragile balance she had clung to was dissolving. As she stepped back into the cold, she knew the letter marked a threshold crossed, and that whatever had been hidden in her past was no longer content to remain so. Always. The truth, once disturbed, moved swiftly through drawing rooms and corridors like a draft no door could fully bar. Whispers sharpened into statements, and statements hardened into judgments. By the time Eleanor sensed the full weight of what had been released, society had already chosen its posture: alert, suspicious, eager. Invitations grew suddenly scarce. Familiar smiles cooled into polite distance. The world that had only recently noticed her now seemed determined to define her before she could speak. Arabella acted first. She summoned sympathy with remarkable precision, presenting herself as wounded yet magnanimous. In carefully selected company, she spoke of confusion, of misplaced kindness mistaken for encouragement, of a sister whose ambitions had outpaced her station. She never raised her voice, never spoke outright falsehood, yet each omission sharpened the story she allowed others to complete. Eleanor heard fragments carried back to her like splinters, each one lodging deeper than the last. The Whitcomb household tightened around the scandal. Their mother spoke of prudence and discretion, of retreat until interest faded. Eleanor listened, recognizing the familiar strategy of erasure reproposed as protection. She was advised, gently yet firmly, to withdraw from public view, to allow matters to settle without her interference. The advice felt like a verdict rendered without trial, and for the first time, she resisted it aloud. She did not see the Duke during those days, though his absence pressed upon her more keenly than presence ever had. She wondered whether the letter he had received had altered his resolve, whether caution had reclaimed him. The uncertainty gnawed at her composure, yet she refused to indulge despair. Whatever followed, she told herself, would be met with the same quiet dignity she had honed over years of invisibility. The summons came unexpectedly, bearing no crest, only a name and an hour. It directed her not to Ravensmere House, but to a formal gathering she had nearly declined. Against instinct, she attended. The hall was crowded, its chandeliers blazing with impersonal brilliance. Eleanor entered alone, acutely aware of the glances that traced her progress, measuring, recalling, speculating. She took her place near a column, steadying her breath. The Duke arrived moments later. His presence did not command the room so much as still it. Conversations faltered, attention converged. He moved with purpose, neither hurried nor hesitant, and when he reached Eleanor, he did not lower his voice. He greeted her as he would any equal acquaintance, with courtesy unmarred by defensiveness. The simplicity of the gesture unsettled the watchers more than any spectacle might have. Arabella observed from across the room, her expression composed, her posture flawless. When the Duke turned, addressing the assembled guests rather than any individual, the silence deepened. He spoke of responsibility, of the dangers of presumption, of how narratives formed without truth could wound irreparably. His tone was measured, his words deliberate, yet beneath them pulsed unmistakable resolve. He did not name Eleanor, nor did he accuse Arabella. Instead, he declared that he would not accept judgment passed without evidence, nor consent to the quiet destruction of character for the sake of convenience. He spoke of having commissioned an inquiry into matters long neglected, records long ignored. The implication rippled outward, unmistakable. Curiosity sharpened into unease. Eleanor felt the weight of every eye upon her, yet she stood unmoving. The Duke's gaze found hers briefly, a silent acknowledgment of shared risk. She understood then that his declaration was not merely defensive but invitational, calling her to stand beside him in uncertainty rather than behind him in safety. The realization steadied her more than any promise could have. Arabella approached before the gathering could dissolve. Her voice was low, her smile immaculate. She spoke of loyalty, of family bonds, of how easily misunderstandings could be corrected if handled privately. Eleanor met her sister's gaze without flinching. She replied with restraint, expressing hope that truth, once uncovered, would serve them all. The exchange was brief, but its balance had shifted irreversibly. As the evening progressed, alliances adjusted with subtle urgency. Some guests withdrew, unwilling to be associated with unresolved scandal. Others lingered, sensing the proximity of revelation. Eleanor moved through the room with a composure she scarcely recognized as her own, no longer shrinking from attention nor seeking it. She felt exposed yet anchored, as though the ground beneath her had finally acknowledged her weight. Later, in a quieter antechamber, the Duke spoke to her alone. He did not apologize for the attention he had drawn, nor did he promise protection without cost. Instead, he told her plainly that whatever truth emerged, it would be faced openly. "I will not measure a woman's worth by the silence imposed upon her," he said, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering. The words resonated with a force that left no room for retreat. Eleanor answered with equal candor. She said she had spent her life accommodating other people's comfort, and that she would not return to that pattern now. She did not ask for rescue, only for the chance to stand without being hidden. The Duke inclined his head, acknowledging not submission but partnership. When they parted, it was without promise of outcome, only of intent. The hall beyond them hummed with unresolved tension, speculation fermenting into expectation. As Eleanor stepped back into the public light, she felt the future press close, no longer distant or abstract. Somewhere, in forgotten ledgers and sealed archives, answers waited. And as the Duke resumed his place among the assembled, Eleanor understood that the declaration had been made, the lines redrawn, and that whatever truth lay buried was about to be brought forth, indifferent to whom might be undone by its arrival. The truth emerged not with spectacle but with weight, as though the years themselves had grown tired of bearing it. Records were retrieved from sealed drawers, correspondence traced through reluctant hands, names compared against ink faded but intact. Each document confirmed what whispers had only suggested. Eleanor Whitcomb was no poor relation, no tolerated companion, but the lawful daughter of the house, concealed not by accident but by design. A legacy diverted, a birth obscured, a life narrowed for the sake of convenience and ambition. The revelation traveled swiftly, yet its force was contained, deliberate. Society, so eager to condemn, now hesitated, recalibrating allegiance with quiet efficiency. The same voices that had speculated with relish now adopted tones of measured regret. Eleanor received the news not with triumph, but with a stillness that startled those who expected outrage. She had lived too long without expectation to greet vindication as victory. Arabella heard the truth in the same room where she had once commanded certainty. The knowledge struck her not as cruelty but as diminishment. She had not lied outright, yet she had benefited from omission, from a silence that elevated her while pressing her sister downward. Her beauty, her polish, her practiced authority could not shield her now from the slow recalculation of worth. She was not cast out, nor publicly shamed, but she felt the subtle shift, the loosening of deference that had once been unquestioned. It was a loss she could neither protest nor repair. Eleanor was summoned to Ravensmere House once more, this time through the front entrance, beneath the same crest that had once felt distant and formidable. The halls received her differently now, not warmer, but more attentive, as though acknowledging her rightful measure. The Duke met her in the library where their understanding had first taken shape. He did not speak at once. Instead, he offered her a seat and waited until she had settled herself, granting space for whatever emotion might surface. She spoke first, not of anger but of clarity. She said that the truth did not alter who she had been, only how others were now permitted to see her. The Duke listened, his expression intent, respectful. He replied that the world was slow to learn, but once it did, it rarely forgot. He said that he admired not the correction of her status but the constancy with which she had endured its absence. There was no dramatic proposal, no flourish intended for witnesses. The Duke told her simply that he wished to stand with her, not as benefactor or defender, but as partner. He said that the courage she had learned in silence surpassed any inherited title. Eleanor answered with equal simplicity. She said that she would not accept a future shaped by gratitude or obligation, only by mutual regard. When he agreed without hesitation, The decision settled between them with quiet certainty. Their union was announced without haste and received without surprise. Society adjusted, as it always did, absorbing the change into its ongoing performance. Eleanor attended her first public gathering as herself, neither hidden nor displayed, but present. She wore no extravagant adornment, yet she carried herself with an ease that drew notice more effectively than ornament ever could. When introduced, she met each gaze steadily, no longer bracing for dismissal. Arabella watched from a measured distance. There was no reconciliation, yet neither was there enmity. The truth had clarified what could not be restored. Eleanor offered her courtesy without condescension, and Arabella received it with an understanding shaped by consequence. The balance between them had altered, not into rivalry but into separation, each now bound to a distinct path. The Duke and Eleanor took their leave of the gathering together, their departure unremarkable in form, decisive in meaning. Outside, the evening air was clear, the sky unburdened by cloud. As they walked toward the waiting carriage, Eleanor paused, taking in the sound of her own name spoken without hesitation. It no longer startled her. It belonged. Later, as the estate settled into night, Eleanor stood at the window of a room she had never been permitted to occupy before. The fire burned low, casting steady warmth. She reflected not on what she had gained, but on what she had survived. The years of silence had shaped her, yes, but they had not diminished her capacity for choice. That realization felt like the truest inheritance. The Duke joined her, his presence neither imposing nor tentative. He remarked upon the stillness, the way truth, once spoken, seemed to quiet even the most restless spaces. Eleanor agreed, adding that silence, when chosen, differed entirely from silence imposed. He took her hand, not as claim but as confirmation. She accepted, feeling the weight of the gesture without fear. As dawn approached, the house remained hushed, as though honoring a transition long overdue. Eleanor knew that the world beyond its walls would continue to judge, to shift, to forget and remember according to its nature. Yet she also knew that she would no longer be shaped by its neglect. She had been hidden, diminished, overlooked, but never erased. The truth had not remade her, it had revealed her. And in that revelation, she stepped forward at last, not into spectacle, but into belonging, carrying with her the quiet authority of a life finally claimed.